Today with Talking Scuba, we're going to be having a chat about diving with more than one cylinder. And more specifically, whether or not, if you're diving with a Twinset, whether you should have a manifold or not. Do we dive our Twinset with a manifold, or do we dive them independently? Now, before we start, I should say that I dive my Twinset independently. I don't have a manifold. And I'll explain why. It doesn't mean that I'm right or wrong, and it doesn't mean that diving with a manifold is right or wrong. It's just a different way of doing it, that's all. You can see here that the manifold valve has threads and O-rings at either end. And when you have a cylinder attached to either end, if those cylinders move, they will fracture the valve. So, the tanks are held together by metal bands. The two cylinders effectively become one unit. The cylinders are held together by two bands like this, with a fairly standard spacing between them, so that no matter what type of backplate and harness you use, your Twinset will bolt to that backplate. I think it's possible to bolt the pair onto a BCD, but I don't know of any that actually do that, although I have been told that it can be done. Now, going back to an assembled Twinset, as you can see on the tanks, the valves are facing out, and this is so that in the event of a failure, the diver can reach behind his back and either isolate the two cylinders or in fact turn one cylinder on or off as needed. With independent cylinders, that's different. You can see here that someone has just grabbed a pair of cylinders, both with the valves facing the same way, and has strapped them onto a BCD. The theory here is that if there's a failure behind the diver's back, then he just lets it get on with it. One of his cylinders will just empty, and he'll soon find out which one that is when he runs out of air, so he simply switches to the other cylinder. With independent cylinders, there is no shutdown procedure that he has to go through. And one of the reasons that I dive independent cylinders is because when I did my Twinset course with a manifolded pair of cylinders, my shoulders just won't go back any further. Too many motorcycle accidents and falling off of horses throughout my 73 years meant it wasn't possible. I could not shut down and go through the shutdown procedure using a manifold. My setup here has two cylinders independently strapped to the BCD. They happen to have the valves poking outwards because it was a Twinset to start with. But the cylinders are held onto the BCD using cam straps. And that means that after a dive, if one of my cylinders has still got plenty of gas in it, I just swap one of the cylinders out. If I have two dives in a day, I can take one spare cylinder with me, swap it out on the rib, and I'm up and running again for a second dive. Because my cylinders aren't bolted on, I don't need a backplate and harness. I can just use my BCD. When I started diving this setup, I ran one side down 100 bar, then the other side, then back again, then forth again. But I realised that there was no need. So, just to try it out, I ran one cylinder from 250 bar, 230 bar, down to 50 bar to see if there's any real difference in the buoyancy, and there wasn't. Typically these days, if I start off with two full tanks, I run my right tank down to about 80 bar and then change tanks. So I in fact only have one regulator swap to do during my dive. My setup is pretty standard. I've got a couple of Scuba Pro Mark 25s upside down on each cylinder. I have a Sunto transmitter one on each cylinder on a short 6-inch hose, and I have an SPG coming down either side as well. And because I have independent tanks, I have independent buoyancy. My left tank feeds my BCD, and my right tank under my right arm feeds my suit. So I've got buoyancy coming from either cylinder in case one of them should fail. I think whichever route you choose, having the balance and the stability of those two cylinders on your back is so much nicer than having one large single cylinder. Having the independent cylinders, for me, using cam bands, means that after each dive, if I need to move my trim forwards or backwards or whatever, it's a simple matter of unclipping the cam band, moving the tank slightly and tightening it back up again, and putting a small pencil mark on the tank so I know where the tank should, where the band should be. For me, it's so much easier being able to pick up each tank individually and move it about. I can move the tanks over to the compressor one at a time and charge them up. An advantage to having a manifolded pair is that you can charge them both at the same time together. When I take my setup on holiday, as I do, I can just ask the boat to have 2 cylinders for me, and any cylinders will go on the back, no matter which way the valves poke, because I'm not going to do a shutdown reaching over my shoulder. Both of my regulators come over my right shoulder, and I have different coloured hoses on them. The pink hose comes from my left tank, and the green hose comes from my right tank. I start off the dive on my right tank using the green hose regulator. My left regulator on the pink hose sits under my chin on a necklace. Because I know that my tanks are independent, when I get to the bottom of the shot line, I just quickly swap my regulators over in my mouth to make sure that my left tank is working properly at pressure, and I can rely on it when I swap over when my right tank goes down to 80 bar. These days I don't feel comfortable going below 20 meters on a single cylinder. I much prefer to have the knowledge that I've got 2 completely independent systems with me, and I like it. I feel very comfortable, and it hasn't let me down so far. My first foray into 2-cylinder diving was when I carried a 7-litre side-slung cylinder with me, just to extend my dive time. So I got quite used to the idea of swapping over my regulator to extend my dive. I changed regulators at about 100 bar, went on to my 7-litre, ran that down to 50 bar, and then back to my back mount cylinder. And that worked well for me. I enjoyed doing that. It became unwieldy though. It became very cumbersome. I did try a manifolded Twinset on my back and just couldn't get on with it. To me, it was effectively the same as having a 24-litre tank on my back. Lots of gas, but for me, without the redundancy. I also have a pair of 8.5-litre tanks, which I can swap very, very quickly onto my BCD if I'm just doing a shallower dive. It just saves lugging 2 12-litre cylinders around. As I said, there's no right, there's no wrong, it's just different. But if you've enjoyed this, great, please click the subscribe button. But whatever you do, keep diving and keep safe.